Don't look at me, cowboy! I found her after they took everything!" The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and gold. Dust rose in small clouds as the wind whispered through the tall grasses of the wide open plains. Jake, a tall man with broad shoulders and hands calloused from years of work, walked steadily along the fence lines of his ranch. His boots made soft thuds against the hard-packed earth, and the smell of fresh hay mixed with the faint scent of horses drifting in the air. Breaths. For Jake, this life had always been simple. It wasn't easy, but it was honest, and it was his. Every morning he woke with the sun, fed the animals, checked the fences, and fixed whatever was broken. It was a routine, but one he liked, and it gave him peace. Jake paused for a moment, resting his hands on the wooden fence post and looking out over the fields. The horses grazed quietly, their tails swishing lazily, and a hawk circled high above, searching for prey. He felt a strange calm, a sense that the world in all its chaos had left this little corner untouched. Yet, deep down, he knew that calm could not last forever. There were whispers in town, stories he had heard in passing, rumors of trouble for some families who had been struggling. Jake wasn't usually one to listen to gossip, but today the whispers seemed heavier, more urgent. There was something in the air, a tension that made him glance around as if expecting it to arrive in the form of a sudden storm. A few miles down the dusty road lived the Peterson family. They weren't rich, but they were good people, working hard to make ends meet on a small farm that had been in their family for generations. Jake had known them from a distance, mostly nodding at them when their paths crossed in town or helping with a fence repair once or twice. But over the past weeks he had begun hearing small hints from neighbors. Things that didn't add up. People mentioned late nights when lights flickered in strange patterns and the Petersons seemed tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. Jake shrugged off the unease at first, telling himself that life could be hard for anyone in the countryside, but the feeling nagged at him. He continued walking along the fence, letting his eyes wander across the horizon. The beauty of the land was undeniable, but beneath it, he sensed something darker. Perhaps it was intuition, a quiet voice that always spoke when he needed it most. He had lived on the plains long enough to know when something was wrong, and right now, he couldn't shake it. A sudden rustling in the brush caught his attention. Jake paused, squinting against the sun. It was probably just a rabbit or a small animal, but his heart beat a little faster. He adjusted his hat and kept walking, his mind turning over the fragments of stories he had heard. In the evenings, Jake liked to sit by the porch, a mug of strong coffee warming his hands, and watch the sky change color. He often thought about the people in the nearby town, their lives, their struggles, and the quiet battles they fought every day. He wasn't a man to involve himself unnecessarily, but sometimes when he saw someone in trouble, he couldn't just walk away. There was a code to his life, one that valued integrity, courage, and the small acts of kindness that made a difference. Today, he felt the stirrings of something that would require all of that. It was around mid-afternoon when Jake finally decided to ride into town. He mounted his horse, a strong brown stallion named Rust, and adjusted the reins. The horse whinnied softly, as if sensing the seriousness in his mood. The ride to town wasn't long, but it gave Jake time to think. He remembered the Petersons' little girl, Lila, a bright-eyed, quiet child who had always been shy but had a spark of curiosity that made her stand out. He hadn't spoken to her much, but he remembered the way she would watch the horses with wonder, sometimes reaching out as if she wanted to touch the freedom she saw in them. There was something about her innocence, her vulnerability that tugged at him now, though he didn't fully understand why.
As he approached the edge of town, Jake noticed a few familiar faces lingering by the general store, speaking in hushed tones.
Their expressions were grim, their hands restless. He slowed his horse and listened from a distance. Bits and pieces of conversation reached him. Talk of a family losing their home, rumors of stolen possessions, whispers of fear and uncertainty. He felt a tightness in his chest. Something bad had happened. Something he couldn't ignore. His gut told him that this was more than misfortune. It was an injustice that left people vulnerable, scared, and alone. Jake tied Rust near the store and stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel. People glanced at him, some nodding in acknowledgement, others avoiding his eyes. He sensed the tension around him, the shared worry of a town that was slowly realizing that bad things didn't always happen to strangers. They happened to neighbors, to children, to families who had nowhere else to turn. He caught sight of a woman carrying a basket of groceries, her hands trembling slightly, and he realized that fear was contagious. Even those who hadn't suffered directly were affected, and it weighed heavily on the town's spirit. He decided to ask around, cautiously approaching a man who looked particularly troubled. "What's going on?" Jake asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. The man looked at him, eyes wide, and shook his head.
It's the Petersons,
They've been through hell. Their farm, it's gone. Everything they had. Taken. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He nodded slowly, digesting the words. He didn't need more details to know that something terrible had happened, something that left a child like Lila alone in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Jake spoke to a few more people, piecing together fragments of the story. Lila was missing, her parents distraught, and the town's attempts to find her had so far failed. The details were hazy, but the pattern was clear. A life torn apart, innocence shattered, and a small girl left in uncertainty. Jake felt a strange pull toward her, a mixture of concern, responsibility, and something deeper he didn't yet understand. It was as if the universe had quietly nudged him, saying, "Go. Pay attention. You are meant to help." By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town, Jake had made a decision. He would search for Lila. He didn't know how he would find her or what dangers might await, but he knew one thing. A child alone in this world needed someone she could trust, someone who wouldn't let her down. He mounted Rust again, the horse sensing the determination in its rider. As they rode back toward the open plains, the wind rushing past, Jake felt a sense of purpose stir in his chest. The calm of his simple life had been disrupted, but for the first time in a long while he felt alive in a way that went beyond routine and work. The plains stretched endlessly before him, the golden grass shimmering in the fading light. Jake's mind was focused, his senses alert. Somewhere out there, hidden among the fields and trees, was Lila. She was scared, confused, and alone, and he would find her. The thought was both daunting and invigorating.
This was different. This was about protecting innocence, about standing up when others had fallen, and about proving that even in a harsh world there were people willing to fight for what was right.
As night began to fall, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Jake adjusted his hat and urged Rust forward. He didn't know what the coming days would bring. He didn't know if he would succeed or if danger lurked ahead, but he felt a strange, quiet certainty that he was on the right path. The story of Lila's life, shattered as it had been, would not end in despair. He would make sure of that. And with that thought he rode on, the wind carrying whispers of hope across the endless plains, and the quiet promise that someone was coming to help, someone she could trust. The night was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Lila huddled beneath a thin blanket in the corner of an abandoned shed, her small frame trembling. She could still hear the echoes of that terrible night, the chaos that had stolen everything from her family. Her parents' cries haunted her memory, and the sound of breaking wood and clanging metal replayed in her mind like a cruel echo she could not escape. She had run as fast as her little legs could carry her, fleeing into the woods, leaving behind the farm that had been her whole world. Now, with the stars above as her only witness, she tried to make sense of the emptiness around her. Lila had always loved her home, even if it was small and humble. She remembered waking up to the smell of fresh bread her mother baked each morning, and the sight of her father tending the fields with sweat on his brow and determination in his eyes. Life hadn't been easy for the Peterson family, but they had each other, and that had been enough. Now, all of that had vanished in a single night. The barn where she had played, the small garden her mother carefully nurtured, the chickens and goats she had fed every morning, all gone. The world felt cruel and unfamiliar, and she felt unbearably small within it. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Fear and sorrow were heavy on her chest, and she felt utterly alone. Every rustle in the dark made her jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her.
Lila had learned quickly that trust was dangerous.
She had seen too much, felt too much to allow herself to hope that anyone could help. But even in her fear, she longed for something she could not name. A sense of safety, a hand to hold, someone to tell her that she was not alone. The night stretched endlessly, but she stayed awake, listening for any sign of danger, refusing to fall asleep lest she be discovered. Meanwhile, the town was abuzz with whispers about what had happened. Neighbors gathered quietly, exchanging worried glances and half-formed plans. No one knew where Lila had gone, and her parents' desperate search had only led to more uncertainty. Some tried to help, leaving food and water near the outskirts of the woods, hoping the frightened girl might find it. Others stayed away, fearful of drawing attention from the people who had caused so much destruction. Rumors grew louder each day, and the story of the Peterson family's misfortune spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of sadness in its wake. Back in the woods, Lila tried to survive as best she could.
Desk webbings. She scavenged for berries and roots, careful to avoid anything that might harm her. At times, she would hear distant voices, but she was too afraid to approach.
Each sound could mean help or danger. Her imagination ran wild, mixing memories of her family with the harsh reality of her current situation. Nights were the hardest. The cold seeped into her bones and hunger gnawed at her stomach. But even when her body cried for warmth and food, her heart ached most for the comfort of her parents' arms. She whispered their names into the darkness, hoping the wind might carry her words to them, even if no one could answer. During the day, she hid among the trees, moving quietly to avoid being seen. She learned the paths of the forest, where the streams ran clear, and which areas were safe from wandering strangers. She became alert to every sound, every movement, every change in the wind. Lila's fear made her small, silent, and cautious, but it also sharpened her senses and strengthened her resolve. She was determined to survive, no matter what it took. The thought of giving up never crossed her mind, even though loneliness weighed heavily on her spirit. Somehow she carried the memory of her family like a secret warmth inside her heart, giving her the courage to endure. Breath. Days turned into nights, and nights into days. Lila's hope ebbed and flowed like the tides of a distant ocean she had never seen. But she wondered if anyone remembered her, if anyone would search tirelessly, or if she was simply a ghost drifting through the forest, unnoticed and forgotten. She often thought of her friends at school, the small joys she had once taken for granted, and the simple happiness of a hug from her mother. Those memories brought both comfort and pain, reminding her of everything she had lost. The world outside seemed vast and threatening, and she felt the weight of vulnerability pressing down on her every step. It was during one of these quiet moments that Jake came into her story, though she did not know it yet. The first time she saw him, she had instinctively ducked behind a tree, her eyes wide with fear. He had been riding along the edge of the woods, his horse steady and calm, scanning the fields and the trails with a watchful eye. Something about him seemed different from the strangers she had encountered in town. He did not approach aggressively or shout her name. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, giving space to the land and its hidden inhabitants. Lila watched him from afar, her curiosity mixed with caution. She did not know whether to trust him, but a part of her longed to see if someone could be kind without causing harm. Jake noticed her too. At first he thought it was a deer or some other small animal darting through the shadows. But as he adjusted his gaze, he caught sight of a small, frightened figure peeking out from behind a tree. Psst. He slowed his horse, careful not to startle her, and kept his distance. Something about her eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity, pulled at him. He could see the smallness of her hands, the trembling in her shoulders, and the way she clutched a piece of tattered cloth for comfort. Jake had faced challenges before: storms, wild animals, accidents, but nothing had prepared him for the fragile humanity of a child who had lost everything she loved.
For several days, Jake observed from a distance.
He left food in small, hidden spots along her path. Bits of bread, apples, water in a canteen. He never approached directly, understanding that trust could not be forced. Lila, at first suspicious, noticed the gifts and gradually accepted them. Each morsel was a small act of kindness that reminded her that not everyone in the world sought to harm her. Slowly, very slowly, she began to feel a flicker of hope, a quiet reassurance that perhaps she was not completely alone. Jake spoke to people in town, gathering what information he could without alarming Lila or endangering her further. He learned about the stolen farm, the chaos of the night she had run away, and the ongoing search efforts. Each piece of information added urgency to his mission. He understood that finding her was only the first step. She needed safety, comfort, and the knowledge that she could rebuild her life. For Jake, this was not a duty or an obligation. It was a calling. He felt a responsibility to stand between her and the harshness of the world until she could find her footing again. Meanwhile, Lila's days were a careful balance of survival and observation. She noticed the tracks of someone moving through the woods, supplies left mysteriously in certain places, and the calm demeanor of the stranger who seemed to respect her space. Her curiosity grew alongside her caution. She began leaving small marks, a twig broken here, a stone placed there, to communicate in her own way, testing if the stranger could understand without threatening her. Narration. Slowly, a silent conversation began, built on trust, patience, and shared humanity. Lila realized that this person, this cowboy, was different from the strangers who had hurt her family. Death. He was not there to take anything. He was there to protect. The first time she spoke to him, it was barely a whisper.
"Don't look at me, cowboy," she said, her voice trembling, eyes downcast. Jake nodded, understanding the fear behind her words.
He didn't force her to meet his gaze or explain anything. He simply left another small gift near her hiding place and retreated. That small act spoke louder than words. It told her that she could choose the moment to trust, that she had control, and that kindness did not always demand compliance. It was a turning point for Lila, a moment where fear met patience, and the first tiny seeds of hope were planted in her heart. As the days passed, their silent relationship grew. Lila began to watch him with careful eyes, learning the patterns of his movement, understanding that he was not a threat. Jake, in turn, learned to read her signs, her hesitation, her small gestures, and the way she responded to his careful kindness. Each interaction, though small, was significant. Trust was fragile, and both knew it could be shattered in an instant. But yet in this fragile dance, something remarkable was happening. A bond formed, one built on patience, respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. Night after night, Lila huddled in her hiding place, warmed by the knowledge that someone cared enough to leave her food, to move gently through her world and to respect her fear. The shadows of the past were still there, but the presence of Jake offered a light, however faint, that she could follow. And somewhere deep in her heart she began to hope. Not for a miracle, but for the small, steady promise that she might one day feel safe again, that she might one day find a place where she belonged. The sun was barely rising, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold, when Jake saddled Rust and began his cautious ride along the edge of the woods again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and the faint aroma of wild flowers. He had been tracking the movements of the small girl for several days now, leaving food, blankets, and small tokens at places he knew she would find them. Every day he checked the area carefully, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to finally see that she was safe. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quiet urgency he could not explain. Something in his gut told him that today might be the day he would finally meet her. He slowed Rust as he neared a clearing. The soft crunch of hooves muffled by the thick grass. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so, except for the distant sound of a stream trickling nearby. Jake scanned the trees and bushes with careful eyes, his heart beating a little faster. There, crouched near a fallen log, he saw her. Lila. She was smaller than he had imagined, her hair messy, her clothes worn and torn from days of hiding. Her eyes, wide and wary, were fixed on him, and for a moment Jake thought she might bolt. He could see the fear etched on her small face, the way she hugged her knees as if to protect herself from the world. "Don't look at me, cowboy!" she whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling. The words were not angry or defiant. They were fragile, filled with fear and uncertainty. Jake froze, understanding that this was her way of trying to protect herself, a shield she had built after losing everything. He did not move closer. He did not try to make her respond. Instead, he dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements calm, careful not to startle her. He lowered himself onto a rock some distance away, sitting quietly, letting her see that he meant no harm. Brish. Time seemed to stretch as they watched each other.
Lila's eyes darted nervously between him and the surrounding woods, her body tense, ready to run at any moment.
Jake said nothing, waiting patiently. He knew that trust could not be forced, that it had to grow naturally. Days of careful observation and small acts of kindness had brought them to this point. Now, it was up to her to decide if she could take the first step toward believing in someone again. Gradually, Lila's curiosity overcame her fear. She inched forward slightly, peeking from behind the log, her eyes never leaving Jake. He smiled softly, a gentle, reassuring smile that carried no judgment, no pressure, only understanding. In his presence, she felt something unfamiliar. Safety. It was not complete safety. Not yet, but it was enough to make her hesitate before fleeing. Jake noticed the subtle shift in her posture and knew that the first step had been taken. Over the next few days, their encounters became a quiet ritual. Jake would leave small gifts, fresh bread, apples, clean water, at a safe distance, and Lila would watch him from afar, sometimes moving closer, sometimes retreating. She tested him, trying to determine if he would harm her or leave her alone. Each day he showed patience and consistency, never breaking her boundaries, never demanding her trust. Slowly, a silent communication developed between them, built on gestures, eye contact, and small acts of care. One morning, after leaving a piece of bread and a bottle of water at a familiar hiding spot, Jake noticed Lila sitting a little closer than usual. She did not speak, but her posture was less rigid, her hands less tightly curled around her knees. He understood that this was progress, a sign that she was beginning to feel safe enough to observe him without fear. Jake left her a small note, written carefully on a scrap of paper, using simple words. "I am not here to hurt you.
You can trust me. He placed it near the food and stepped back, giving her space.
When she read it, her eyes lingered on the words, and for a brief moment, a flicker of hope passed across her face. The bond between them grew slowly, each interaction building a fragile trust. Begun. Lila began to recognize the sound of Rust's hooves on the ground, the gentle creak of the saddle, the soft rustle of Jake's movements. These small signs became comforting, a signal that help was near. She still did not fully approach him, but she no longer ran at the first sight of him. Jake, in turn, learned to read her cues, the way she shifted slightly, the way she adjusted her position, the subtle expressions that betrayed her emotions. He realized that patience was as crucial as action, that rushing would only drive her further away. One afternoon, a sudden rustle in the bushes startled them both. Lila froze, and Jake raised his hand in a calming gesture. Out from the undergrowth came a small rabbit, hopping nervously before disappearing into the grass. Lila's shoulders relaxed, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Jake chuckled softly, a sound that carried warmth and reassurance. "Say, nothing to be afraid of," he said gently, though she could barely hear him. The moment, though small, marked a turning point. Lila realized that not everything approaching her meant danger. Jake's presence, steady and calm, was something different, something she could learn to trust. As days turned into weeks, Jake continued his careful efforts. He repaired broken branches near her hiding spots, cleared debris that might harm her, and left small comforts, blankets, warm clothing, even a soft stuffed animal he had found at a market in town. Bears. Lila began to notice these gestures, feeling the unspoken message behind them. "You are not alone. I will not let anything happen to you." For the first time since the night her world had been shattered, she felt a glimmer of safety, a fragile warmth that eased the cold grip of fear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Jake spoke for the first time in her presence. His voice was low and calm, gentle like the evening breeze. Breaths.
Lila, I know you've been through a lot. I can't imagine how hard it's been, but I want you to know you are safe.
You don't have to be afraid anymore. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that touched her heart. Lila looked at him, her eyes wide and hesitant, as if she wanted to believe him but was not sure how. She whispered again, almost to herself, "Don't look at me, cowboy." And yet, she did not run. That night, she slept a little closer to the supplies he had left, and for the first time she did not wake at every sound. The wind no longer felt threatening. It was just the wind. The darkness no longer pressed against her. It was just the night. Jake's presence, even from a distance, brought a quiet assurance that she could not explain. She was beginning to understand that trust was not about words alone. It was about actions, consistency, and patience. In Jake, she found all of these things, and it gave her courage she had not felt in days. As the days passed, their silent partnership deepened. Lila began to leave small tokens for him in return. A carefully arranged pile of sticks, a leaf pressed into the soil, a tiny flower placed on a rock. Jake noticed each one, recognizing them as her way of saying, "I see you. I trust you a little." It was a language of hope, fragile but growing, and it filled both of their hearts with cautious optimism. Jake knew that healing would take time, that fear would not disappear overnight, but each small step was progress, and it mattered more than anything.
One afternoon, after a morning of careful observation, Jake decided it was time to take a risk.
He moved a little closer, stopping at a safe distance from the clearing.
Lila froze, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, eyes wide with uncertainty.
He raised his hand slowly in a gesture of peace, and for the first time, he spoke her name clearly. "Lila," he said softly. "It's me. You're safe." Breaths. "You don't have to hide anymore." For a long moment, she did not move. Her eyes darted between him and the shadows of the trees. Fear and instinct warred with the small growing spark of trust. Vibration. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she took a small step forward, her bare feet brushing the grass. Jake stayed completely still, letting her lead the interaction, giving her control over the moment. Another step, and then another. Finally, she stopped a few feet away, her eyes locked on his, still wary, but less fearful than before. Jake smiled a gentle, warm smile and spoke again. "You don't have to be afraid. I won't hurt you. I promise." Lila's lips quivered, but she did not look away. She felt a strange comfort in his presence, a quiet strength that reassured her. For the first time since that terrible night, she allowed herself to believe that someone could care, that someone could be on her side. Prestad. And in that fragile moment, a bond was formed, one built not on words or promises alone, but on patience, understanding, and the quiet power of being seen without judgment. But, for the first time, she knew that safety was possible, and that someone, finally, was willing to help her find it. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, golden and warm, casting long shadows across the plains. Lila sat quietly on a fallen log, clutching the blanket Jake had left her, her small hands pressed tightly around the worn fabric. She had finally begun to trust him, but she still felt fragile, as if the world could shatter her at any moment. Jake approached slowly, keeping his distance, and spoke softly.
"We need to take a step forward, Lila. There's a way to find what was taken from you and make things right."
Lila's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear reflecting in them. The idea of facing the people who had destroyed her home, taken her parents' belongings, and left her alone seemed terrifying. Breath. Yet the thought of regaining even a small piece of her old life stirred something deep inside her, a spark she had almost forgotten. She looked at Jake, and in his steady, calm presence she felt a courage she did not know she had. With a small nod, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could face what lay ahead.
Jake knew the journey would not be easy.
The people responsible for the chaos were dangerous, cunning, and ruthless. Many in town were too afraid to confront them, and the authorities could do little without solid evidence. But Jake had faced difficult situations before, and he understood the importance of patience, observation, and careful planning. This was not about recklessness or seeking revenge. It was about helping Lila reclaim her life and restore a sense of justice to the world around her. The first step was preparation. Jake and Lila spent days gathering information, carefully observing the movements of those who had caused so much harm. They spoke with neighbors, collecting stories and piecing together the events of that fateful night.
Lila listened intently, her small hands fidgeting with the edges of her blanket as she absorbed the details.
She began to understand the extent of the situation. Not just the loss of property, but the fear that had been sown, the way lives had been upended, and the lingering threat that still hung over the town. Throughout it all, Jake remained patient. He never pressured her to speak beyond what she felt comfortable with, and he allowed her to take small steps at her own pace. Trust, he knew, was fragile, and any misstep could push her back into the shadows. Each day he left small supplies, food, water, clothing, at safe locations, ensuring she was comfortable and cared for. Lila began to respond, leaving small marks, subtle signs that she was ready to move forward. Slowly, a plan began to form. A careful, cautious plan to confront the injustice that had upended her life. The journey itself was daunting. They traveled on horseback through uneven terrain, the plains stretching endlessly around them. Jake guided Rust carefully, navigating rocky paths and dense forests, always keeping an eye out for signs of danger. Lila rode behind him, holding tightly to the reins, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and anticipation. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant sound made her heart race, but Jake's calm presence reassured her. He taught her to notice patterns in nature, to listen to the wind, and to read the subtle signs that indicated safety or danger. As they moved closer to the places where the stolen items had been taken, tension grew. Jake could sense Lila's apprehension, the way she flinched at sudden movements, and the cautious way she followed his instructions. He spoke to her gently, encouraging her, reminding her of the strength she had discovered within herself over the past weeks.
"You are braver than you think, Lila,"
he said one afternoon as they paused near a stream.
"Every step you take is proof of that. I won't let anything happen to you."
Breaths. She nodded quietly, feeling a small sense of pride. For the first time in weeks, she felt capable, empowered, and ready to face the challenges ahead. The first confrontation came unexpectedly.
They had been observing a small group of men moving goods in a secluded area near the edge of town.
Jake recognized some of the items immediately. Tools, containers, and even small personal belongings that had belonged to Lila's family. His jaw tightened as he studied the scene, calculating the safest way to approach without endangering Lila. He explained the plan to her quietly, emphasizing that she must stay hidden and observe until he signaled. Lila nodded, gripping the blanket tightly, her heart pounding but trusting Jake completely. With careful precision, Jake approached the group, using the natural cover of trees and rocks to remain unseen. He called out only when necessary, speaking in a firm, authoritative voice that demanded attention. The men were startled, caught off guard by the unexpected presence of someone who seemed determined and confident. Jake explained calmly but firmly that the items they had taken belonged to innocent families and needed to be returned. His words were measured, carrying a quiet authority that left little room for argument. Lila watched from her hiding spot, her breath held tight in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of the moment. And yet she felt safe knowing Jake was there. Slowly the men began to comply, realizing that resistance was futile against someone who approached with determination, intelligence, and calm courage. They handed over several of the stolen items, some of which Jake immediately recognized as belonging to Lila's family. Relief washed over her, mingled with a cautious sense of hope. Pray. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. They still needed to recover the remaining items, ensure that those responsible could no longer threaten innocent lives. Bust. Over the next few days, they moved strategically, using careful planning and observation to avoid unnecessary danger.
Jake taught Lila how to notice details, how to read intentions and body language, and how to stay aware without panicking.
But each day, Lila grew stronger, more confident, and more capable. She began to see herself not just as a victim, but as someone who could reclaim what had been taken from her. Throughout the journey, Jake and Lila's bond deepened. They shared quiet conversations during their travels, speaking about dreams, fears, and small hopes for the future. Lila spoke cautiously about the things she had lost, the memories that haunted her, and the fear that still lingered. Jake listened patiently, offering gentle encouragement and unwavering support. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Every step of the way, Jake reminded her that she was never alone, that someone would always be there to guide and protect her. Finally, after days of careful effort, they recovered most of the stolen property. Tools, personal belongings, and small keepsakes were returned to the rightful owners. Lila's eyes filled with tears as she saw familiar items she had thought were lost forever. The farm may have been damaged, but the heart of her family's life, the small objects and memories that carried meaning, was coming back to her. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt a sense of restoration, a fragile but growing hope that her world could be rebuilt. Jake remained vigilant, knowing that the threat had not completely disappeared. But the most important part was achieved. Lila had faced the danger, reclaimed what was hers, and discovered the strength within herself to survive and move forward. Her bond with Jake, built on patience, trust, and courage, had become unbreakable. She understood now that safety was not just a place, it was the presence of someone who cared deeply and acted with integrity, even in the face of danger. By the time they returned to the outskirts of town, the sun was high, casting warm light over the plains. Lila rode beside Jake, her posture confident, her eyes bright with determination. She had faced fear, endured uncertainty, and reclaimed pieces of her life that had been stolen. And through it all, Jake had been by her side, not as a savior, but as a guide, a protector, and a witness to her courage. As they approached familiar ground, Lila realized something profound. The world was not as cruel as she had believed. There were people who would fight for what was right, who would offer patience, kindness, and unwavering support. She had discovered that courage was not something that arrived fully formed. It grew through experience, through small steps, and through the presence of someone who believed in her even when she doubted herself. For Jake, the journey had been equally transformative. He had faced challenges he had never anticipated, tested his patience and judgment, and discovered the profound impact of quiet, consistent care. He had witnessed the resilience of a child who had endured unimaginable loss and had helped her find her strength again. In the end, the journey was not just about reclaiming stolen items. It was about restoring hope, teaching courage, and proving that even in the harshest circumstances, trust and kindness could prevail. As they finally paused near the edge of the woods, Lila looked at Jake with gratitude shining in her eyes. She had reclaimed pieces of her life, but more importantly, she had regained a sense of herself. The road ahead would still have challenges, and the scars of the past would remain. But she was no longer alone. With Jake by her side, she knew that whatever came next, she could face it with courage, resilience, and hope. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, casting a gentle golden glow across the fields. Lila stood at the edge of the old farm, her small hands gripping the fence tightly as she looked around. The farm had been damaged, its barns and fences scarred from the chaos of that night, but it was still there. And now, thanks to Jake, she could finally begin to reclaim it. The familiar scent of earth and grass filled her nose, mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers her mother had planted long ago. For the first time in weeks, Lila felt a quiet sense of peace. Jake approached slowly, Russ's hooves making soft sounds against the dry ground. He had stayed nearby during the night, ensuring she would feel safe returning to the farm. Lila turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, a newfound strength that had been born through hardship, fear, and careful guidance. Jake gave her a warm smile, one that said everything he felt without needing words. Then he had watched her grow, seen her courage bloom, and knew that she was ready to take the next step in reclaiming her life. The journey back to the farm had been slow and careful. Lila had insisted on walking parts of the path, her small feet brushing the tall grass, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. Jake had stayed beside her, never rushing, never forcing her, offering quiet reassurance with each step. Desperate, along the way they had gathered the remaining items that had been taken, slowly returning them to the place they belonged. Tools, personal belongings, and keepsakes that had once seemed lost were now scattered across the farm, each item a small victory, a reminder that the past could be recovered, piece by piece. When they reached the house, Lila paused. The door was weathered, and the windows were streaked with dust, but it was home. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar rooms, but different now. Strange, yet comforting. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of her mother's cooking, was quiet, and the furniture was scattered from the chaos. But it was still her home, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Jake stayed near the doorway, giving her space but remaining within sight, ready to step in if needed. Lila knelt down, running her fingers over the floorboards, the worn edges of the furniture, the small objects that had survived.
Each touch brought memories flooding back, the laughter of her parents, the warmth of family dinners, the small joys of everyday life.
Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, and of cautious happiness. She had survived the unimaginable, and now she could begin to rebuild. Over the next few days, Jake and Lila worked tirelessly. They repaired broken fences, cleared debris, and organized the recovered belongings. Neighbors, inspired by Lila's courage and Jake's guidance, came to help as well. Some brought tools, others brought food, and a few stayed to offer support and encouragement. The sense of community, of people coming together to restore what had been lost, filled Lila with warmth. She realized that even in the harshest circumstances, kindness and cooperation could rebuild what was broken. As they worked, Jake taught her small skills she had never learned before. He showed her how to mend fences properly, how to care for the animals, and how to manage the tools that had been returned.
Lila absorbed everything eagerly, her determination shining brighter each day. She was no longer the small, frightened girl hiding in the woods.
She was becoming strong, capable, and confident. The fear that had haunted her was still present at times, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Evenings became a time for reflection. Lila and Jake would sit quietly on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they simply shared the silence, letting the calm of the evening settle over them. Lila would talk about her dreams for the future. Simple dreams at first, like planting new flowers, feeding the animals, and helping her parents rebuild. But gradually, her dreams grew bolder. She imagined a farm full of life, a place where she and others could find safety and joy. She thought about school, friends, and the possibility of traveling beyond the town she had always known. Jake listened, offering encouragement and gentle advice. He reminded her that progress took time, that rebuilding was not just about the physical farm, but about restoring her confidence, her sense of safety, and her belief in the goodness of people. He showed her that setbacks might happen, but each challenge could be met with patience and resilience. Lila began to internalize these lessons, understanding that her journey was far from over, but that she was no longer powerless. One morning, as they were fixing a section of the fence, Lila stopped and looked out across the fields. "Jake," she said softly, "I think I can finally face them."
The people who did this, I don't feel as scared as I did before.
Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You're ready," he said. "You've grown stronger than you realize, and no matter what happens, you'll never face it alone." Those words resonated with her, giving her courage she had never known she possessed. She understood that strength was not just about physical ability, but about trust, patience, and the willingness to stand up for oneself. With Jake's guidance, they approached the last step, confronting the remaining threats to ensure they could never harm her family again. Lila's heart raced as they neared the area where danger had once lurked. But she no longer felt paralyzed by fear. She walked beside Jake, confident in her abilities and in the protection he offered. Their teamwork, built on trust and patience, allowed them to navigate the situation carefully. The people responsible, seeing the determination and courage in both of them, retreated without incident. Lila realized that facing fear head-on, with support and careful planning, could yield powerful results. Returning to the farm after this final step, Lila felt a sense of closure she had never imagined possible. The worst of her ordeal was behind her, and the future stretched out before her like the endless plains. She looked at Jake, gratitude and admiration shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jake smiled, shaking his head gently. "You did this yourself, Lila. I was just here to guide you. You found your courage, your strength, and your hope." As the weeks passed, life on the farm slowly returned to a new normal. Lila's parents, though deeply affected by the events, found comfort in the restoration of their home and the safety of their daughter. The farm, though scarred, began to thrive again, nurtured by the care of neighbors, the determination of its owners, and the guidance of Jake. Lila helped wherever she could, her confidence growing daily. She laughed more freely, played with the animals, and even began planning new projects to improve the farm. Each day was a small victory, a reminder that life could continue, and that hope could be rebuilt even after loss. One evening, as the sun set in a fiery display of oranges and reds, Lila stood at the edge of the field, looking at the horizon. She felt a quiet strength within her, a sense of resilience that had been forged through fear, patience, and courage. She knew that challenges would come again, but she also knew that she had the skills, the support, and the determination to face them. Jake stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the reins of Rust, watching her with pride. They did not need to speak. The bond they had formed over weeks of struggle and triumph was clear. They had faced fear together, reclaimed what was lost, and found hope in the process. Break. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Lila felt a sense of peace she had not known in a long time. The farm was still imperfect, the world still uncertain, but she had learned something invaluable, that courage, trust, and kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. Right. She turned to Jake one last time that evening and smiled, a smile full of gratitude, strength, and quiet joy. "Some things," she whispered, "may be lost forever, but some things can be found again." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The stolen items, the lost home, the fear of that terrible night. These were pieces of the past. But trust, hope, courage, and the bond they had formed, these were treasures that could never be taken away. Lila had discovered them, and with them she could face the future with confidence, strength, and the knowledge that she was never truly alone.
The story of that farm, the stolen life, and the quiet cowboy who had guided her through darkness ended not in despair, but in renewal.
Destiny. Lila had been found, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. She had faced fear, reclaimed her life, and discovered the power of trust and kindness. And as she stood under the wide-open sky watching the stars twinkle above, she knew that her journey, though difficult, had brought her to a place of hope, healing, and a future full of possibilities.